why I make poor art. And now I think about it, I don't think I ever remember starving. Welcome to my channel. I'm Robin McClendon, and this is Pause 23, A Beautiful Resistance. So what does that have to do with poor art? Let's get into it. There was a movement in the 60s and 70s called Art Povera. In the late 1960s, amid Italy's rapid industrialization and political unrest, a group of radical artists gave birth to Art Povera, literally poor art, coined by art critic Germano Salant. The term didn't refer to poverty in a purely economic sense, but to deliberate rejection of the slick, commercialized art world and the polished aesthetics of consumer culture. Instead, these artists use humble, everyday materials, dirt, rags, rocks, twigs, glass, iron, to challenge the spectacle of capitalism, industrialization, and the rise of mass production. Their work was raw, transient, visceral, reflecting a kind of poetic protest that resisted the commodification of both objects and ideas. So Art Povera was and still is a beautiful resistance. I'm suggesting let's bring Art Povera back. It reminds us that art does not require wealth or perfection to be powerful. These artists acted as cultural seers, grounding their work in local materials and personal mythologies, while standing firm against globalism's flattening hand. In doing so, they illuminated the fragility of nature, the absurdity of waste, and human spirit's persistence in face of excess. Like all great art movements born in tension, Art Povera was a mirror, a quiet rebellion, holding space for truth in times of transformation. I love that. I love that. And I want to share the essence of that with my community this week. And I was thinking about this the other day as I was working in my journal and working on this week's pause. That comes out of our other pauses, this idea of a beautiful resistance. And I'll explain how I came to that pause. But it brought me to this idea of when I was early on in my art career, or just in my life. And I was out of college, and I was working in a job that was a great job, and good career, oriented and on a good career path, and all of that. But it was not resonating with me. I did not like it at all. And so I thought, I gotta do something else. So I at the time did have a studio, and I was working in my studio Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. And but I was young, the job paid well, but you pay by the time you do your housing and this thing and that thing. You guys know, I didn't really have a lot of money left to really invest in my art career. Now you have to know that 30 years ago, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have social media, you didn't have the connectivity to lots of ideas and the thought the community oftentimes bring when you can see what people are doing elsewhere in the world. The art world was structured a certain kind of way. You had galleries and you had museum systems, and that was pretty much what you were going to deal with when you thought about being a working artist. With that came a respect for materials, right? So you had to have archival, good papers and paints and all these kind of things because you were going to sell your art, and you needed to make sure it was of a certain quality. Now, how many of you can put your hand up on the fact that if you were starting in your art and you don't quite know what you're doing, and you're trying to find your style and your voice, but you're locked into this archival, you have to have the best materials thing, it's a bit of a mess because you get these materials that cost so much, and then you're afraid to make a mistake. You're afraid to start working on it. And the minute you do something you don't like, you're like, oh my goodness, you just messed up, back then $20 or $30 worth of material. And you're like, and that was a big struggle for me, really trying to figure, like really sort of living that artist life, right? So what's funny is that as I think about where I am now, and I look back to where I was then, dealing with that was really very stifling. One of the things after a few years of dealing with messing up materials and still not knowing what my voice is and what my style or technique is, that's when I really started art journaling a lot. I used to get those really big journals from Utrecht back then. We had Utrechts in DC. And they were good quality without being, crazy price points. And I would get the really super large one, and I would work in the journals. And it was a great place for me to start working my ideas through without feeling like I'm messing things up. And that was where I really started my my process and my commitment to journaling, because it really worked for me. So fast forward to now. I can afford the materials that I want to use. I can work with the best materials. That's not a concern for me any longer. I have my style. I'm very confident when I go to work, so I'm not thinking I'm a mess. I mean, the furthest thing from my mind is I'm going to mess something up. So that's not any longer. And guess what? I like working with all the throwaway art, all the poor art, all of the cardboard and discarded materials, and the waste and old fabrics and just all the discarded stuff. And primarily because, of course, it's a statement and it's about me being conscious about just not throwing a lot of stuff away. And a lot of these things are perfectly suited for my work because I like aged textural materials, things that that grunge and that sort of really lived in kind of look to them. But in addition to that, what really attracts me is they come with a story. They come with a story. They come already with something that speaks to me that I can continue to build on, right? So it's this idea that it's poor art or trash throwaway pieces, but they're rich. They're rich in content and storyline. And I'm sure that's why many of you like these same styles. We're all attracted to these same styles. So it's just funny, the dichotomy and how life, kind of comes full circle. This idea that, of course, I like working with beautiful materials, and I still will work with the best, but it's not an always thing. It's not one of those things that I feel like I'm compelled to have to work with those materials. And actually, I have more joy working with the throwaway things. So Art Povera really inspired me this week, because the pause being a beautiful resistance and coming out of, our other pauses around, nothing is wasted. And, I'm just looking back through my book, there's so many of them here, right? And we've been talking about how the various movements have come out of times like the ones we're living in, where artists have had this ability to respond in really amazing ways to the chaos or the marching on of global, economies and, consumerism and the corporatocracy and all that kind of thing. I feel like we're at this amazing place as visual artists that we can be a part of a beautiful resistance, very much like the earlier artists and so many other art movements. I've just selected this one today because I really related to this idea of poor art, and I figured you guys would also. I think it's something that's really relevant. You know, in my community, we do something called, you know, hashtag post-consumer art, and it's dealing with all of the packaging that, you know, we get. It's all over the place. So Art Povera, I thought that the beautiful doesn't necessarily mean that we're making beautiful art, you know, the things have to be pretty, but it's beautiful in that we're able to create these dialogues and use the things that mean the most to us, be it the symbols, iconography, words, the things that we really enjoy using in our work. It can come together in our voice, and that voice can be resistance to those things that we don't agree with, or we're not in alignment with, or that we would like to see differently. And it's a resistance that I feel that through the visual arts, only visual artists are able to do, because we don't have to use words or the spoken or the written word. With just color and elements of art, texture, symbolisms, whatever it is that is based your genre, you know, you can use these things to shape your story. And hopefully, you know, people are able to look at your work and walk away with what's on your heart that you want to share in this way. So I just feel like we have this amazing opportunity to create beautiful resistance in our studios every single day, but from a standpoint of our heart space, of joy, of peace, of happiness, of a passion. And it's not always, you know, every time we're in a studio, we're not always feeling the most uplifted. Sometimes we're triggered, you know, but using those emotions in our art is a beautiful process. And that way of resisting is fundamentally productive. You know, we're being proactive, not reactive, because we're putting things into something, not receiving something that triggers us. And, you know, I just, you know, want us to think about that this week. In between, you know, all the things that we're doing in our pauses, how can you bring the feelings and the thoughts that you have about what's going on in the world into your art in a way that you create this really beautiful resistance, very much like Art Povera. I'm going to read to you here a little bit about what it is so you have an idea. I encourage you to go and look it up, see what some of your favorite artists are. One of my favorite artists that when I first saw his work years ago, I was in the library at the Corcoran, and I came across his work. His name is Fontana, and he's the one that does canvases. He would paint them and he would just slash them, just not these marks through them, and just open the canvas up a bit. And it just made the surface of the canvas very sculptural. And I thought, how simple, but how cool, you know? And I always remember my first impression of that. I later found out that he was a part of Art Povera. Also Burry, I love Burry. He does what they call material poetry. And he uses the same things, he used all kinds of materials that were basically throwaway. In his work, he did a lot of piecing of fabrics and stuff like that together in these large paintings and color fields. He even had one project where he took a large open field and he filled it up with a lot of concrete and just throwaway stuff, and he sort of made this big concrete farmland type of thing. And it was a statement about, of course, you know, are we going to bring this idea of expansion and growth and sort of, but globalism, consumption onto our farmlands, that they're just completely concrete. It's a pretty cool project. You have to look them up. And they were a part of this movement. This is how artists always have operated. I think that because we are mostly online these days and we really don't have the smaller communities that we're a part of to really talk about these things and hash these ideas out, we kind of use social media to kind of sort of allow our voice to come out that way. So we are oftentimes commenting or putting up comments and stuff on our own pages. And where that definitely has its place, are we channeling that back into our art? Are we putting up art that's really channeling maybe this beautiful resistance, and yet we can still write about like what was going on for us in it? So just something to think about. This week I really had a lot of fun with the journal. This is what the pages are looking like. This is a eucalyptus leaf that I've got on the ground when I was in Portugal. There's a number of them just laying on the ground. I just loved. But it also sort of has this crescent shape that I really love. And so using a lot of found objects, a lot of old papers, I sort of kind of created this typography sort of design with the pages. But what I had the most fun with is I had a bunch of old press type, like the chart pack. They're like letter set and you rub on. I don't know if you guys remember those or even know what they are. And so I put Arte Povera across the page there. And it really popped it and gave it this 70s type of, 70s, 80s type of typography. And I had the best fun doing that. I used to do that all the time when I had studied graphic design, and we used to use a lot of those type of chart pack, letters and screens and all that kind of stuff. And it took me back to those days. It was really funny how tactile, just returning to some old techniques, like techniques we did 30 years ago prior to the digitalization of everything and computers. We didn't have all that stuff. And so this sort of press type stuff was made it so easy. But just doing that really had me to also not only think about the idea of the materials that you use in art in terms of the throwaways, the poor art type of concept, but techniques, like these throwaway techniques that we don't do any longer because we can do, like shiny, crisp, quick things on Canva and things like that, and print them out and have these amazing graphics and what have you. And in the 70s and the 80s, that wasn't what was happening. You didn't have that type of technology. So thinking about going back to some of the older pre Mac desktop, right, your personal computer techniques. And so I'm exploring those more. So I invite you to find some old press type. I don't even know if you can get them in the stores any longer. I didn't even look into it because I had some that I came across in my collection, and I thought, well, let me just try using it. And it's amazing. As old as it is, it worked beautifully. So there was a longevity to this product such that it was almost waiting for a time like this for me to rediscover it. So I'm going to be using a lot more of this press type in my work. But I invite you to also think back to maybe some techniques that you even just did 10 years ago or 15 years ago that you aren't doing now. Or maybe something that you've seen and you never tried it because, oh, that's probably old school. Nobody's really doing that any longer. I invite you to go back to some of that and bring it into your art and see how it makes you feel. There's been so much that's been disposable these days. And I'm inviting some of these older techniques and, of course, throwaway materials into my art studio, into my visual dialogues, and, of course, into my heart, because that's where the passion and the pleasure is. And so, yeah, exciting. So this week, is a beautiful resistance. I invite you to look up Art Povera. I invite you to maybe think about some old technique, or even see if you can find some press type. There might be some online. I'll have to look, because I didn't before filming this video, and see if there's some press on letters, or anything else like that. And bring it into your work, and just sort of think differently this week. You guys take care. So much love.